Hey, welcome to the fourth Harvard Data Science Initiative Bias Squared seminar. I'm David Parks, and together with Francesca Dominici, I am one of the Harvard Data Science Initiative's two faculty co-directors. This series is part of our larger Bias Squared program, which we launched in September of last year as a part of our effort to address the structures in our field that reinforce bias and systemic racism, while at the same time looking to promote the good that can come from data science in removing and uncovering bias in present-day decision systems. The monthly seminars in this flagship series complement a newly established research fund and an expanded graduate fellowship program at the Data Science Initiative. So now it's my honor to introduce Rashida Richardson. Rashida is a visiting scholar at Rutgers Law School and soon to be professor of law and political science at our neighbor here in Boston, Northeastern University. She's also a senior fellow with the German Marshall Fund of the United States, which is a nonpartisan American public policy think tank and grant-making institution dedicated to promoting cooperation and understanding between North America and Europe. With a JD in law from Northeastern and an undergraduate degree from the College of Social Studies at Wesleyan, Rashida specializes in race, emerging technologies, and the law. She's well known for her research into the social and civil rights implications of data-driven technologies, including artificial intelligence, and she develops policy interventions and regulatory strategies regarding data-driven technologies and government surveillance, discrimination, and the technology sector. She's also previously worked on a range of civil rights issues, including as the director of public policy research at NYU's AI Now Institute and the Legislative Council of New York's ACLU. She also serves on many boards, including the advisory board of the Civil Rights and Restorative Justice Project and EPIC, the Electronic Privacy Information Center. So as a reminder, you may post your questions for Rashida throughout her talk using the Q&A functionality in Zoom at the bottom of the screen. And at the end of the talk, we will then invite our postdoctoral fellow, Isabel Fulcher, to moderate your questions. So today, Rashida will be giving a talk based on her essay, Government Data Practice as Necropolitics and Racial Arithmetic. Welcome, Rashida.
Thank you, David. I'm gonna share my screen.
Great.
Can everyone?
And we can see that, that's perfect.
So before I get started, I just wanted, thank you for noting that this talk is based on an essay I've previously wrote, which is linked in the event page, but I wanted to note and encourage the audience to read other essays in this series. It's called Data and Pandemic Politics, and there's a lot of good work there, so I just wanted to do a little plug for others who have contributed to the series. So in 2019, I published Dirty Data, Bad Predictions, How Civil Rights Violations Impact Police Data, Predictive Policing Systems, and Justice in NYU Law Review Online. In that article, I posited that policing practices, policies, as well as structural inequities in society shape the environment and methodology by which data is created, which results in police and criminal justice data sets exhibiting misrepresentations, inaccuracies, and skewed or systemically biased data known as dirty data. To demonstrate this point, I examined police departments that were found to have engaged in corrupt, racially biased, and unconstitutional policing practices and policies through government commissioned investigations, court decisions, and other forms of adjudication. While this scholarship has been extremely helpful in broadening public understanding of dirty data and the problems it poses when used in predictive and other data analytic tools, it did not answer many questions about how prevalent dirty data is across several sensitive social domains, including policing, healthcare, child welfare, education, and more. Why many government data sets exhibit a range of racial disproportionality and disparities, and why these problems persist, yet many data scientists appear optimistic about applying big data for social good. It is not possible to tackle all of these questions in a 1-hour talk or even in one academic paper. But today, and in my original essay, I hope to explore some of the logics underlying government data practices that will help give some color to the answers for some of these questions. And here's what I intend to cover for the remainder of our time. First, I will present two theories of control and oppression that are crucial for understanding and evaluating the relationship between the exercise of sovereign power and discretion and structural conditions that produce racial disparities in the quality of life and mortality of Black Americans. These theories are necropolitics and racial arithmetic. Together, these theories offer a useful framework for evaluating government data practices and how they contribute to racial disparities and harms in the United States. Next, I will provide brief overviews of practices of collecting, using, and reporting ethnoracial data in the public health and policing sectors in the United States to explore how these government data practices have a negative impact on the quality of life and mortality of Black Americans using the dual framework of necropolitics and racial arithmetic. And it's worth noting up front that throughout my presentation, my discussion of mortality is intentionally focused on rates of excess death, which refers to the difference between the numbers of death observed in Black and other minority populations and the number that would have been expected if these populations had the same age and sex-specific death rates as the white population. Or to put more plainly, these are observed deaths that should not have otherwise happened but for structural conditions, systemic racism, or a global pandemic as we're all experiencing now. And then I'll end with some concluding remarks on why this all matters. Cameroonian political theorist Achalla Mbembe presented the concept of necropolitics first in an essay and later in a book. And the opening sentences of his canonical essay state his argument plainly. This essay assumes that the ultimate expression of sovereignty resides to a large degree in the power and capacity to dictate who may live and who must die. Hence, to kill or to allow to live constitutes the limits of sovereignty, its fundamental attributes. To exercise sovereignty is to exercise control over mortality and to define life as the deployment and manifestation of power. To demonstrate this thesis, Mbembe explores logics and practices of oppression that resulted in and often legitimized the death of certain communities throughout history, including slavery, Nazism, and colonial occupation and warfare. Sociologist Michael Rodriguez Muniz advanced the concept of racial arithmetic, which refers to the use of ethnoracial data and statistics by political actors to determine or justify the distributions of rights and resources or to make political claims. He argues that throughout US history, ethnoracial statistics were almost exclusively used to institute and legitimize white supremacy. And he offers racial arithmetic as a conceptual framework for evaluating political entities and projects, and to inform political and legal efforts to address ethno-racial exclusion and inequality. In this book chapter, he detailed the use of racial arithmetic in a redistricting effort in Chicago, Illinois. Sorry, y'all, I live in New York. It's loud outside.
we could hardly hear.
Okay, great. Today, and in my essay, I argue that necropolitics and racial arithmetic are useful frameworks for evaluating and understanding government data practices in the digital age and the persistence of racial disparities in most social policy domains. To exercise sovereignty is the power to authorize and enforce what information is relevant and necessary to govern. In modern American governance, data collection, reporting, sharing, and use are common and necessary parts of the administrative state that is regulated and enabled through an assortment of laws, formal and informal policies, practices, and decisions by local, state, and federal government actors. Necropolitics and racial arithmetic help us understand that the racial justice implications of government control, discretion, and regulation over ethno-racial data and statistics. Racial arithmetic helps us see that government practices regarding ethno-racial data and statistics are employed to justify or legitimize government argumentation and decision-making regarding the distribution of rights and resources. Necropolitics helps us see that ultimately these decisions and practices create structural conditions that determine the quality of life and mortality within the Black community. Public health and policing represent two extremes of these practices and their consequences. First, I'll discuss public health and the current COVID-19 global pandemic, as it is an emergent example of the problem of ethnoracial data deficits and how they contribute to racial inequities in society. It is now well known and accepted that COVID-19 has disproportionately affected Black, Indigenous, and people of color. But around this time last year, when reports of COVID-19 reported cases and related deaths began to emerge, there was less consensus about this reality and its causes. Early data revealed that Black people were dying at disproportionate rates, which led to coordinated advocacy demanding federal and state governments publish race and ethnicity breakdowns of COVID-19 data. Since then, the National Academy of State Health Policy has been tracking how states collect, report, and act on COVID-19 ethnoracial data, and found that while all states are now reporting ethnoracial data for COVID-19 cases, states reporting on ethnoracial data regarding testing, hospitalization, mortality, and vaccination remains inconsistent. Ethnoracial data deficits have been a persistent problem in the United States, and research has identified several causes and contributors to this problem, such as outdated information systems that make it difficult to include new data categories, or erroneous beliefs that federal and state law prohibit the collection of race and ethnic data by healthcare providers, insurance companies, and local officials. Yet these data deficits contribute to growing racial disparities in health and mortality, because without this information, racial variations in health problems, access to care, quality of care, and health outcomes remain unknown, under-researched, and misunderstood. When this absence of data is coupled with a lack of understanding of how racial and structural inequities exist and have worsened over time, it leaves room for racist explanations or narratives to prevail, suggesting that health and mortality disparities are the result of biological, cultural, or other innate factors other factors that are innate to the individuals or groups, rather than seeing these disparities as evidence of racially biased structural conditions and social practices. In fact, the economist Glenn Loury observed and named this phenomena politically consequential cognitive distortions, because it can also negatively impact one's views regarding solutions or remedies. He argues that the tendency to assume that disadvantage or differences observed amongst a group of people are intrinsic to that group can lead observers to be opposed to policy solutions or systemic reforms. And in the context of big data and algorithms, this can mean that simplistic technical solutions are pursued, which can distort and avoid interrogation of the root causes of such disparities or disadvantages, or they can have the unintended consequence of hampering or delaying necessary policy solutions or systemic reform. For example, a recent article in the New England Journal of Medicine found that a number of clinical diagnostic algorithms used in cardiology, urology, oncology, and more employed adjustments based on the patient's race or ethnicity that potentially perpetuated or amplified race-based health inequities. The authors of this article posited that rather than critically examining the causes of racial difference in the algorithmic outputs, the adjustments or corrections were developed likely based on flawed assumptions about racial difference, which served to mask or worsen the problems rather than addressing the root cause. And this problem of defaulting to racist assumptions, explanations, and narratives to explain disparities or anomalies that are the result of ethno-racial health data deficits is not just that it can lead to flawed health practices and technologies, as the last slide demonstrated, but that they can be leveraged or weaponized by policymakers applying racial arithmetic and necropolitics. First, we cannot ignore the fact that the drivers of the problem that lead to ethno-racial health data deficits are tied to the exercise of sovereign power. If outdated government information systems impede the inclusion of ethno-racial data, then we cannot ignore that it's government officials deciding that the cost of upgrading information systems and practices to include the collection, use, and reporting of ethno-racial health data are prohibitive or not a priority. Similarly, federal, state, and local laws and regulations set the conditions under which ethno-racial data is collected by healthcare providers, insurance companies, and local officials. But there's great confusion about what is required in practice. For example, Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 prohibits racial discrimination by any entity that receives federal financial assistance, which tends to include most healthcare providers. The act in itself does not require any particular data collection, and federal courts have found that the enforcement of data collection requirements under Title VI is left to the discretion of federal agencies that run programs covered by the act. So specifications about what data to collect and what methods to use can vary by agency. Though there are competing interests regarding the governance of health data, the lack of coordination and inconsistent health data practices are still one of many political choices. The second part of this problem is that policymakers can and have used ethno-racial data deficits along with racist assumptions and narratives to justify racially disparate austerity measures, community divestment, underfunded research, and the lack of meaningful safeguards and enforcement against various forms of medical, healthcare, and other forms of discrimination, all of which have a negative impact on the quality of life of Black people. For example, last year, early on in the pandemic, Massachusetts issued initial guidelines for rationing ventilators and other critical care services during a potential surge of COVID-19 cases, which advised hospital staff to use a scoring system that significantly disadvantaged and deprioritized individuals with comorbid conditions that could impact long-term survival. Even though these guidelines were race neutral and explicitly prohibited consideration of sensitive factors like race, disability, gender, and ability to pay, policymakers seem to ignore that people of color, poor people, people with disabilities are more likely to have these underlying comorbid conditions, and therefore less likely to receive necessary critical care and potentially die as a result of this policy. Luckily, there was immediate public backlash, and the Massachusetts Department of Public Health revised the guidelines with the acknowledgement that poverty and racism can damage a person's health. But the underlying logics of necropolitics and racial arithmetic cannot be ignored. The lack of ethno-racial health data collection, use, and public reporting, coupled with the ignorance about the drivers of racial health disparities, helps conceal and legitimize discriminatory practices and policies along with their consequences that in turn worsen pre-existing structural and social inequities that have a negative impact on the quality of life of Black people and increases our excess deaths. And before I move on to policing, I want to emphasize that my concerns regarding COVID-19 continue, because early data on the vaccine rollout show that there are extreme racial disparities in vaccination. While some government officials blame these disparities on hesitations within the Black and Latinx communities based on documented histories of government abuse, some reporting is demonstrating other causes, like disparities in where vaccination sites are located. Policing represents a different extreme of government practices regarding ethno-racial data, and that data collection and use are fairly routine in policing, but police departments are gatekeepers of such information and often use this gatekeeping function to thwart systemic police reforms. As a result, law enforcement's control of and resistance to public reporting and sharing of ethno-racial police data not only impedes overdue institutional changes, but it also obscures the societal impact of policing practices and policies, specifically the deleterious effect of policing on Black life. Police routinely collect and use ethno-racial data. Race and ethnicity are common categories in police administrative forms and data sets. And there are also many state and local laws that mandate the collection of these identity characteristics during police activities, like traffic and pedestrian stops. Police import this data into data analysis software. They use it to inform routine practices and strategies, and they share this data with other government agencies and officials. Yet police are and have always been resistant to reporting or sharing ethnoracial police data with the public. By controlling what information about policing is available to the public, police are able to avoid accountability by using selective data to obfuscate discriminatory and often deadly police practices and policies. And before I advance this point, I want to emphasize that this problem is both persistent and systemic. It is not just a modern day big data policing practice or problem. Take this 1973 article from the Chicago Defender with the headline that states, "Secrecy is a standard police procedure." After a government report revealed that 98% of complaints of abusive conduct by Chicago police officers were rejected by the department, and that information regarding these investigations and the evidence examined were withheld from the public. Ironically, the article points to the New York City Police Department as a model because the department allegedly shared information with researchers. But as the following slides will reveal, the NYPD's practices are also muddled. In fact, I argue that the NYPD's data practices are perhaps one of the most pronounced examples of necropolitics in racial arithmetic in action. Though ethnoracial statistical analysis of the NYPD's stop and frisk data ultimately convinced a federal judge to rule the department's policies unconstitutional in 2013, it took over a decade of lawsuits to incrementally compel the NYPD to publicly release ethnoracial data of its stop, question, and frisk practices to reach this verdict. After the 1999 murder of Amadou Diallo, the New York City Council passed the police reporting law, which required the NYPD to produce annual reports, including various details about its stop and frisk practices. Yet, shortly after the 2006 murder of Sean Bell, it was revealed that the NYPD failed to comply with this law and had not released data since 2003. In 2007, the NYPD released limited data and resisted public records requests seeking access to the entire stop and frisk database, even though the NYPD shared this database with research groups at RAND and the University of Michigan. It took a lawsuit and subsequent court order for the department to release the database in response to a public records request, with a state judge noting, "The NYPD has not offered any reason why the petitioner should be denied access to the same database, which it has already shared with other outside organizations." And after this information was released publicly, and following years of significant non-compliance with reporting requirements of a consent decree regarding the NYPD stop and frisk practices, a new class action lawsuit was filed, which eventually resulted in the aforementioned 2013 federal court decision finding the policy unconstitutional. Throughout this period, the NYPD's used its control over stop and frisk data as a form of racial arithmetic. The NYPD and other government officials selectively used police administrative data to justify the department's stop and frisk practices, suggesting that more stops meant less crime. But when the same data was eventually shared during litigation, it functioned as evidence that the NYPD's stop and frisk policy and practices were racially discriminatory. Stop and frisk practices alone can function as a form of necropolitics because these discretionary and often unreasonable police actions contribute to immediate or excess deaths of Black people. But these circumstances are worsened by the fact that the NYPD's withholding of ethnoracial police data from the public allowed these practices to continue without meaningful oversight or accountability, which then creates a reality where Black people are more than twice as likely to be killed by police than persons of any other racial or ethnic groups. Public health and policing represent two extremes of the problems with government practices regarding the collection, use, and public reporting or sharing of the ethnoracial data. Government practices in the public health sector represent one extreme where insufficient collection, use, and reporting of ethnoracial health data can disguise underlying problems and tacit discrimination that aggravate and hasten racial inequities and harms, including excess death. Whereas government practices in policing represent another extreme, where ethnoracial police data is regularly collected and used within government, but rarely shared proactively with the public, which obfuscates and normalizes negative differential treatment and outcomes experienced by Black people, including disproportionate rates of death from police violence. Racial arithmetic and necropolitics help us understand and evaluate this relationship between the exercise of sovereign power and discretion, and racial disparities and harms in the United States. Together, they provide a useful framework for not only diagnosing drivers of racial inequities and harms, but this analysis can also aid the development of meaningful solutions to address dirty data and algorithmic bias. Models of society that are created from big data are inevitably biased, and a growing body of interdisciplinary research helps explain why. Sometimes data sets reflect inequities prevalent in society. Sometimes they reflect bias in practices and policies. Sometimes they reflect design choices made by those creating the data sets, and more. But if we want to mitigate problems of dirty data and algorithmic bias, we need to fully understand their root causes, because many of the solutions we will need will not solely be technical or mathematical. We must also understand that these solutions need to be multifaceted and adaptable, because data sets and algorithmic technologies are not immune to changes in society. Notions of what is legal, moral, and possible are ever evolving and can vary by cultural context. But these normative stances are also directly affected by how data sets and algorithmic systems are developed, as well as how we as individuals and a society respond to them. Using these frameworks that improve and inform critical analysis of current and historical structural and systemic inequities, like necropolitics and racial arithmetic, can provide us with analytical and strategic agility to identify interventions that improve technology development in a way that moves us towards becoming a more inclusive and equitable society, rather than creating technologies that reinforce and worsen the status quo. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Rashida, for a enlightening talk about the views on what are the challenges that we're facing around access to data, and as you spoke to the kind of the monopolization of data as well in large parts of our society. I think we can have a good conversation now. I would like, as a next step, to introduce Isabel Fulcher. Izzy is a 2019 Harvard Data Science Initiative postdoctoral fellow in the Department of Global Health and Social Medicine at HMS. Her research aims to develop innovative causal inference methodologies to improve the delivery of sexual and reproductive health care to at-risk populations. She's especially interested in statistical challenges around unmeasured confounding and spillover effects on networks. And she's currently working to evaluate and improve the implementation of digital maternal health interventions in Tanzania and Rwanda. As part of these global partnerships, Izzy is committed to statistical capacity building by supporting in-country researchers to participate in and lead research. And earlier, she has her PhD in biostatistics from Harvard, where she was advised by Professor Eric Chechen. So Rashida, thank you again. And I'm gonna hand over to Izzy, who has some questions.
Thank you.
David, thank you so much, Rashida, for that amazing talk. I think some of the first questions that have come in are around the theme of data, which is also central to your talk. So I'll start with some of those and we'll see where the conversation takes us. So our first question, so you spoke convincingly to the need for more openness or democratization of data, for example, in regard to policing. Do you worry that data can be then misused by the public or other interested parties when it is released, or by others following bad data science on the data? So using the data to conduct bad data science and draw different conclusions. Is there a third way that could be beneficial?
Yeah, so humans can misuse anything, including data. So I think like saying whether it can be misused by the public and government is just like, that's just a reality. The importance of transparency in open data is that it can help inform better regulations and practices to helping, I guess, contain or address some of the problems that I observed. And I think a common response that I more often hear in government about the downside of having open data is like, what if people misuse it? And I think that's where the types of data categories you have and whether and how well and whether or not the data can be properly de-identified and anonymized is where some of those concerns come from. But I don't think the fear of bad actors using data in negative ways is enough to justify all of the downsides that come from the lack of collection or even the lack of sharing, as I described in the presentation. And I also think it's unfair to assume that it's okay for marginalized communities to bear that burden of the lack of transparency, which has been kind of the practice throughout US history. I think you can create either regulations or even consequences for such abuses to hopefully help hinder or hamper such efforts. But I don't think those concerns outweigh sort of the actual harm that's being experienced due to either the two sort of aspects of the problem that I covered in the presentation. And if anything, I think it can help identify more solutions to actually addressing those problems. So in the health context, it's like we can find ways to address racial disparities in health outcomes or racial disparities in access to care, or better understand why such disparities exist amongst more marginalized populations. In the policing context, I'm obviously less sympathetic. It didn't come through in the presentation, in that I think we're well overdue for the need of systemic reform in policing. And I don't think that sharing more information about policing will cause problems. If anything, it can help us understand what are the necessary localized solutions that each locality will need, as well as better understanding the role of police, because I think part of the problem with policing is that we've used police as the primary government response to everything. And we don't really know how to deal with harm in a holistic way in this society. So perhaps having a better understanding of the downsides that are actually being experienced from current policing practices and policies can help us better evaluate other solutions for dealing with harm or dealing with issues in society.
Great. So that actually leads into another question perfectly. So if data is available for public consumption, and then it is actually used and put into practice, what would be the adequate mechanism or mechanisms of oversight to ensure transparent and ethical use of that data, and particularly in the policing context? So,
okay, so part of this is difficult to answer, but thanks for narrowing it on policing, because I'm like, that's federal, state, and local law issues. But I think for policing, having open data there's many sort of confines you can put on it, but it also depends on what information is being released. So right now there's more of a national conversation about the lack of open data and transparency regarding police disciplinary records, since we know that abuse of power is a pervasive and persistent issue in this country. And so there's privacy concerns for the officers, but I think that's where you have to kind of weigh out the societal benefits and privacy intrusion for the individual officer, and also the fact that they're a government employee employee. So there's a different type of privacy analysis that's applied there. But I think in that circumstance, having that information can help bolster existing oversight systems. In that if you, like I'm based in New York, where we have both an inspector general that's supposed to oversee aspects of the NYPD, as well as a civilian review board. And they have different, they kind of have different realms of responsibility, but having if the public has more access to that information, it may enhance the roles of oversight and accountability that those bodies are supposed to have. And then I also think, to what I said what I answered in the last question, is that I think the larger issue with policing here is like, we don't know how to deal with harm or even conflict well in the society. And I think having better insight, or at least the public having more information into what is actually happening, how government resources are being spent, can help inform, I guess, more productive conversations about where we should be going. There was a slide I had somewhere in there that showed the fiscal year 2021 budget for Boston. That was actually a slide prepared by the ACLU of Massachusetts, just to demonstrate how much money is going into policing. And I didn't want to make it obnoxious, but if you looked at the numbers, even if you combined all of the potentially health categories, it would still not come even close to what was being spent on policing. And that's why I wanted to emphasize the point that these are political choices about where we choose to spend money, and that I can't even count on, well, to go with a recent example, here in New York, we passed the POST Act, which is the Public Oversight of Surveillance Technologies, which requires the NYPD to annually report the surveillance technologies that it's using. And they reported 35, I believe, which is still an undercount, because if you look at different reporting, they've reported other technologies that they didn't report in compliance with that law. And I believe that becomes a good governance argument of, we see the amount of money being spent on information systems in policing, yet we have a healthcare system with information systems that are outdated or not working to help us make informed decisions. And I think when the public has access to not only the budgetary information of how much money is being spent, but also seeing those outcomes of, do we actually feel safer? Are crimes actually being solved? Then it allows us to have a more comprehensive conversation about not only how government money is being spent, but also is the current sort of structure and makeup of government the best way to address the sort of contemporary problems we're dealing with as a society.
So I know you just gave one example of how in New York, how data was or made more transparent or reported. So have there been any other recent advancements, either directly because of your work or similar work of others, that has led to data being more publicly available? And this audience member wants to know, particularly in relation to policing.
Yeah, so that's tough, and I'm actually going to complicate some of what I just said, in that there are more like open data laws generally that would allow for access to not only information on policing, but in government in general, but many of them are not that comprehensive. So you're still dealing with kind of the illusion of openness and not the reality of it. And then you have a number of surveillance technology transparency laws. The one I mentioned in New York is one of many. I think there's over 25 that have passed throughout the country, and they're all a little different in that some require transparency reporting before something is even purchased, and allows for government bodies to actually approve or reject such purchases. In New York's it's not that, it's simply they just report what they have. But I wouldn't even say these laws are kind of the solution, in that they're a diagnostic tool to better understanding what's there, what's being spent in government. But even with the most recent reporting with the POST Act, the NYPD did not make a good faith effort in reporting, in that they didn't perform much of the analysis that was necessary. As I mentioned, there are systems that were not reported in compliance with that law, but there's a recent auditing that the city did with algorithmic systems, and there's systems that are reported in that report that aren't in the POST Act report. So you have this issue of whether or not government is acting in good faith with its openness, and whether or not there's mechanisms to hold government agencies accountable when they don't comply. And I think what I just described is more of the problem that we have, in that there aren't many oversights or accountability mechanisms. So all we have to rely on is the good faith of government. So I do think, and I don't want to say that to dissuade such efforts. I think this is a step in the right direction, in that the more that we know, the more that we understand the nature of the problem and can hopefully inform the right solutions. But open data, or even more openness and transparency of data, is not going to be the end-all solution. It's just more a way of understanding the nature of the problem and ways forward.
Right. And so I think this might feed into a definition you gave early in your talk, which was about dirty data, which I will ask you to redefine when answering this question, just to bring us all up to speed. So how prevalent is dirty data across social domains? And to what extent is it coming about in domains where data is collected ethically? And to what extent is it coming about as a result of data being collected by poor practices and policies?
Okay, I'm going to try this. I may ask you to come back and
Yeah.
tell me some of the question. So dirty data is a term that comes from data mining. I tried to expand it to include the methodologies and sort of observations of what's happening in society in that paper that I referenced at the beginning of the talk, but it's dealing with inaccuracies, misrepresentations, and other types of bias or skews that can exist in a data set. And it's not, and these dirty data is not always just from nefarious use. You can have a clerical error in inputting data that is also encompassed by dirty data. But also something I point out in that paper is, and was kind of represented in a later slide, is there's tons of omissions, in that we have this false notion that government data sets, or even just data sets about society, are accurate representations of reality, when it's just a bit, it's one tiny bit, and often a subjective version, in that there's many people here viewing this talk, and everyone, if you ask them to give a one-sentence description of what happened, would give a different answer. And if that was to represent, and if we only chose one to represent what happened in a data set, then that's to just give an understanding of how it can be skewed. To the question that I actually posed as to myself in the slide of how prevalent is it in other social domains? We don't know. This is why this is an emerging area of research. I pointed out a few sectors that I know the problems exist in just from doing work in those areas. So education is one. I think I mentioned child welfare as another, healthcare. These are all sectors where you have similar problems that I described in that paper, of government data sets more likely reflecting government practices and policies than necessarily the problem that these data sets are supposed to reveal. So if it's an issue of school discipline, if it's an issue of child harm and abuse, these are all going to reflect what is happening in the government institutions, not necessarily a representation of which children are being abused, or rather all of the children being abused, or what is actually happening in the educational system. And the third part of that question was about how to fix it, or sorry.
I think you actually answered it. It was about understanding where the dirty data comes from. Is it mostly from data that is collected from in an ethical way, however we define that, or is it by poor practices and policies? But it kind of sounds like it can come about in any way.
Yeah, I think the inherent problem is data cannot represent everything about reality, yet we want it to, and it's often implied in settings where it's used for prognostic tasks like predictive policing, or just data analytics generally. When it's applied in those settings, we're acting as if the data is reflecting reality, and that's kind of the disconnect in the problem. But also I did want to say something, because when you raised the question of ethical data collection, I was like, what is that? And that there are, like, while there may be standards around documentation and research, I think it's important to understand that government data collection is an administrative task. It's often coming from laws, policies, formal and informal, around what is being collected and how. But the problem is that government data sets are being collected for those administrative tasks or certain functions, not necessarily then to be applied in a data analysis software or some predictive system. So there's also this disconnect between the fact that data is being collected for specific reasons and under specific understandings in government, but then being used and extrapolated and applied in other contexts. And often by developers who do not necessarily have as great expertise in the domain to be able to then apply existing technical fixes to those data sets. And that if you don't have a good understanding of a local police's practices, priorities, then how do you really know what is missing in a data set? And in the paper, I even highlight how priorities can skew what's in data sets and omissions by highlighting the fact that white collar crime is both underreported, underinvestigated, and therefore less data is collected, even though it happens at a frequency that's, if you combine property crime and violent crime all together, it happens at a much higher frequency than those crimes, which tend to be the types of crimes that are mandated by law to collect or even used in applied settings.
Great. I do want to switch to talk, because you defined a lot of new terms for me in this talk, which was great as a way to kind of conceptualize these issues. And so I want to kind of dive into, for me to, and I'm sure the audience members, to get a better understanding of what some of these terms mean. So in terms of racial arithmetic, if you could give one or two examples in relation to the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic in terms of resource allocation. And another question is the definition of racial arithmetic, does it always have a negative connotation? So could it be used by political actors to actually increase resource allocation where it's needed, or advocate for rights of certain groups?
I'm going to answer this in reverse, if that's okay. So first, to the question about whether racial arithmetic can be applied for good. Yes, but this again is like a political question, in that you could technically say forms of affirmative action are a way of applying racial arithmetic for good. Yet it's a politically vexed issue that is just getting gutted over time. So I think part of the issue is that we have more examples of negative outcomes that are produced by the application of racial arithmetic, and a longer history of that, because it's like, I think overall it's what the author describes, and he uses a great example of looking at voting redistricting in Chicago, and showed how essentially numbers around ethno-racial data and voting was used to paint a picture of a zero-sum game when they were trying to redistrict Chicago. So it was that it's like the Black communities had certain representation, that the Latinx communities had representation in the white communities. There's more diversity in Chicago, but this was the main breakdown of who was represented. And what happened there is politicians kept trying to make it seem that the Black and Latinx communities had to lose or gain representation, when the reality is that white voters were overrepresented due to gerrymandering. And that's an example where it's just using data to, and I think this is a better example of how racial arithmetic is used to make certain political claims. But again, it's also an example of one about the distributions of rights and resources, and that how one is represented in government should be proportionate, but due to years of gerrymandering, that's not the case. And then for the first question, other examples in the health, it's tough to give more COVID-19 specific ones, because like we're living through it. And that's why I kind of ended with my concern around vaccine rollout, because I'm like, we're experiencing this right now. And I did do a dig at Cuomo. I don't like him, but it's because I actually heard when he made that statement and was kind of frustrated because as a New Yorker, as someone sitting here and looking at how vaccine rollout is happening, and also someone hyper cognizant of the histories of abuse that make many people hesitant about using the vaccine. I also see a lot of people cutting lines and the issues around access. So it was kind of frustrating for me to hear a politician saying like, oh, it's only because people are hesitant because of this history as a means of justifying why there were such disproportionate rates in vaccination in communities of color, when I'm living here and seeing the reality of I live with an elderly aunt who's only now just getting a vaccine appointment because there was none in an area that unless we could drive her to, she could access, and it's also infrastructure issues of people not being able to get the appointments because of either digital divide issues and that you needed a website, then they made a phone number. But those are, I think that's, I guess, as current as I can give of an example. But I thought it was an interesting contrast because I think in the slide I had a picture of the city of Baton Rouge where you could see it was a little more egregious in how vaccination sites were not evenly dispersed throughout the city. And it matters because segregation is still very much a reality in this country. And when you have politicians leaning into a real reality and fear among certain communities, meanwhile, not making the best good faith effort in either where these vaccination centers are, or even in trying to understand and mitigate these concerns overall. It's just like another way I can see the disproportionality as sort of persisting, but in this example, the concern is it becomes like this victim blaming kind of narrative of like, these people just don't understand that this is necessary, when in reality, it's like, actually the government could have done more, but it's easier to ignore the realities and one's complicity when you do have a convenient sort of counter narrative.
Yeah, that makes sense. We have another question about racial arithmetic from the audience. So is racial arithmetic a cause of the quantification of race? More generally, how can we theoretically understand when and how race is quantified under a logic of racial arithmetic versus the kind of collection and transparency that you would advocate for?
Okay, I'm having a little difficulty with this because of the quantification of race. I guess I offer racial arithmetic as one way of understanding how both data, like how you have data deficits as I described in health, or an absence or hesitance to sharing information with the public. But how race is I'm sorry to whoever asked this question. I'm having difficulty with it because I'm wondering if you're asking essentially like how we mark race in a data set or how it is quantified then applied. But I can keep struggling with trying to answer this.
Yeah, I interpreted quantification of race as measuring it and reporting it.
Okay.
But we can also move on to another question.
Yeah, sorry.
They can still clarify in the Q&A and we can come back to it.
Please clarify and I'll try to answer.
He actually just clarified.
Okay.
He says, how is it quantified and then applied? So I guess the question is a desire for racial arithmetic a cause for how race is quantified and then applied? And then more generally, help us to understand when this racial arithmetic is leading to this versus when the data, or when is the data being collected as a result of this type of racial arithmetic, and when is it being collected for the right reasons? And is there a way for us to kind of grapple with and understand when for the right reasons and when not for the right reasons?
So I'm going to answer this in a few ways. First, racial arithmetic can compound the problems that I was describing. And I made this point around how the use of ethnoracial data or statistics can be used to justify racially disparate austerity measures, underfunding of research, and other government policies that lead to racially disparate outcomes. And that is a way you kind of have this feedback loop of policy then generating or compounding the problem. But but it's hard to kind of, I also want to separate it in some regards, in that collection and quantification of race also varies, and it should vary by sector, and that in policing, collection of race information, as I had in some of the slides, is often and should be done by what the officer perceives, because that's important for understanding the context of the stop or what happened in a situation. In that race is a social construct, so you can have someone who looks like Isabel who's passing, yet they identify as Black. And so it's important to understand how that person is perceived in society or by an officer in a certain interaction, to understand whether or not, or to what extent, race was relevant to an encounter. Whereas in healthcare settings, often that's information that can be volunteered, or a patient can say, I identify as this, or fill out the information in a form. And that's where it becomes a little bit more complicated, because it becomes harder to understand issues around service and quality of care when you only have how the patient identifies and not necessarily how a provider may perceive that individual. And I think that, and there is more research coming out around the need to have more nuances in how we collect race data in healthcare environments to understand these differences in quality of service and quality of care. And so for that reason, I think it's like you can't necessarily see this as a perpetual feedback loop, because there's different dynamics and needs in how data is collected and applied in different settings. And this is also why you can't necessarily just collect data in a very standardized way across different social policy domains, because those distinctions, as I'm describing, can have very important value to then how that data is used to either inform policy or practices down the line. So I think it's just like the W.E.B. Du Bois said, the problem of the color line is the problem of the 20th century, and it's going to continue to be a problem in this country, because it's like we can't escape it, and we also don't want to address it. So it's this challenge of like how much data would be enough to justify the fact that we need to address structural conditions. And it's like you could have all the data available, but it doesn't mean that those pushing for reforms or changes in structural conditions necessarily have the political or even economic power to lead to those changes. So then that becomes a matter of politics, not data. So I'm giving all like a million answers to this, because I don't think it's that simple. And I'm simply just trying to provide some nuance to both why I'm having difficulty answering it, but also why these solutions are not as, like, we're not going to find silver bullet solutions to these problems, but it's likely going to have to be incremental reforms of, okay, we collect more data, we create more mandates and see whether or not that information works. If not, we may have to start back at square one. And I think that's one thing as we as a society, and especially policymakers, need to gain more comfort with, accepting failure and also understanding the need to restart or even redo things in a new way.
Great. I think I will do two more questions. The first question, I think, will still relate to this idea of data collection, and we'll end with a question that's more thinking forward, what to do once we have all of this data collected. So you've made a really good case that police departments should make their data more public, and that asymmetries in access to police data lets police obfuscate just how racially biased their law enforcement can be. But what are the limits of how open police data should be? Should we live stream every police body cam? What principles should guide our thinking on when data should be open versus guarded?
So no, we shouldn't live stream all police. And I think that's a difference in that, do you, like, yes, video stream is a form of data, but that's not necessarily what I'm advocating around or was talking about. And I also want to emphasize that I don't see open data or transparency as a solution to issues of abuse of power, or it's more that these are the first steps we need to informing what is necessary to come, in that right now we're in the same way in the space of algorithmic bias. We talk about black boxes. We're dealing with government as a black box, in that we don't fully understand what is both happening in government, and at least in policing, there's this resistance to sharing that information with the public, because that gatekeeping function, it helps enhance power. And really, like, now that I've said it, it's like this all goes down to power at some point. But I do think, and I'll be explicit about it, I do think there are limits to transparency and open data. I don't see them as solutions. I just see them as primarily diagnostic tools, or means for us doing more critical and structural analysis of problems. And it's in part just what's been required and how policy making has happened over time, in that, like, you constantly hear policymakers say, we need evidence-based solutions. Well, you can't come up with those if you don't have the data. And I also don't think that data, as I've said in a few of my answers here, is going to be the solution, in that some of these issues are inherently political and will come down to collective action and community engagement in these issues. And I also don't think that everything, like, even if we have more data, I'm not advocating that we're going to find algorithmic or technical solutions to all of this, because sometimes, like, if it hasn't become clear, I think a lot of this is about resource allocation, where we're spending money in society. So you could say, like, we could spend more money in schools and on community services, and that's something that, like, data can have us help us have a better understanding about where money is being spent in government, and where we can reallocate, so it can inform better decision making. But it doesn't necessarily mean that having open data and then applying it to math formulas is necessarily going to be our way out of this.
Yeah, that's a great point. So I think our final question of the day. Your work lies squarely at the intersection of data science and the law. Is current legal training adequate in preparing new lawyers to navigate issues around data and racial disparities driven by inadequate data collection, or any of the other issues we've talked about today?
Oh, I love this question, whoever asked it. No, yes and no. In part because I say yes, because it's like, I teach these courses. So yes, like, and I think we're starting to see more universities wanting to have interdisciplinary type classes, where I know, like, Harvard has a class between the law school and the engineering school, or with MIT. But it's where it's engineers and lawyers in the room. So it's both teaching the two groups who are in a position to hopefully address these issues, but also allowing for that sort of multidisciplinary interaction. But I also think, like, it's like I struggle, because I also am a big critic of, like, academia and legal academia, and that, like, I don't think teaching lawyers about big data is necessarily going to make public defenders better at defending their clients, because there's tons of structural problems within the system that would have to be addressed even before you get there. If anything, having more lawyers understanding these issues can help us both identify the problems a little bit sooner, hopefully, if they have information or data collection and information systems to support such discoveries. But also it can help with figuring out solutions. But at the same time, these are not all data problems, like I described in describing dirty data. Sometimes data is just reflecting structural inequities in society. So us figuring out a way to make an automated decision system more fair is not going to solve the fact that some communities are completely divested from or not receiving the same or equitable amounts of resources as others, or it doesn't help solve issues of school segregation. Like, we have a lot of different societal problems that data will not be the solution out of. And in fact, I would argue the law in some ways has been an impediment to some of these issues. And that's in part because this is my critique of the judiciary, of how case law has evolved over time. And so I think in some ways, having more legal education around these issues can be helpful, at least in helping lawyers anticipate and be better at advocating for clients. But ideally, it can help us think more creatively about the changes that need to happen in government. I'm getting to the point where I'm just like, we need to scrap it all and we need a completely new framework in the legal system, just because it's like I'm a student of critical race theory. So I see all of the ways our constitutional standards just reinforce racial hierarchy, not necessarily solve it. I also am a former lobbyist and primarily a policy attorney. So I also understand that most laws are a compromise, and that they're not always designed to solve the problems that they're necessarily marketed or messaged as solutions to. So I think we need a lot of different people to be informed about these problems to identify ways forward, but I also don't think it's all on lawyers. Like, if anything, I was trying to emphasize in this talk the fact that we need data scientists, computer science majors, mathematicians to have a better understanding of structural inequality. I think there's a complete lack of understanding of how society actually is, which makes, I kind of added that question in my early slides about like, why is this problem persisting, yet applying data science for good continues to be a problem. And it's in part this disconnect of not fully understanding how society is operating in reality to be fully informed about kind of the constraints of database solutions. And also the limits of technical fixes, because I know, like, I am up to speed on a lot of the recent research on ways to address algorithmic or even big data bias through technical fixes. But that's why I emphasized at the end, like, that's not going to be our way out, because if data sets are just reflecting what's happening in society or government practices, then obviously those require different solutions, legal or otherwise.
Great. And I'm really glad that we ended on this question, because your last point about training almost data scientists and computer scientists, people to understand these structural inequities is also could be a path forward. And that's exactly what this seminar series is kind of for. So yeah, this was fantastic. Thank you so much for the presentation and answering all the different questions that came through.
Thank you for having me, and thank you all for joining in the middle of Thursday afternoon.
Thank you so much, Rashida, for sharing your scholarship. You've really helped us to think critically about these challenges around data and power. I think you've really lit this alive for us, and also sharing with us your thinking about legal training, about society more broadly, and for such an engaging talk. As you heard from Isabel, we at the Harvard Data Science Initiative believe this dialogue is important, and that's why we're just happy to host scholars like yourself. I also want to thank Isabel for engaging with you in this very rich conversation the two of you have been having through the questions from our audience. And thank you to our audience, and apologies to the many of you who have open questions still that we weren't able to answer. We are going to be continuing our seminar series on bias, where we are looking to bridge between the math, computer science, data folks and the policy scholars. And our next Bias Squared seminar will be held on Thursday, March 25th at 1:30 p.m. Eastern, and will feature Desmond Patton and Kathy McEwen from Columbia University. So please join us then, and thank you again, Rashida. Bye.
Thank you.